David Klingler,
Karis Nelson,
Benjamin Offens,
Anna DeMott,
Riley Pretty.
Weakening the Wall, Hidden 20th Century Turning Points. The electrifying fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 elated the American people,
doomed the career of Mikhail Gorbachev,
and set off a dramatic domino effect,
which led to the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1991.
Why was this wall built in the first place?
To restrain freedom,
restrict movement,
and limit the rights of the people, unfortunate enough to be on the wrong side when it went up in 1961.
Even as the DDR built the wall taller, wider, and stronger, the freedom-loving people of East Germany never gave up on trying to break through it.
They dug under the wall, drove through the wall.
But on one largely unforeseen day, all escape attempts were rendered unnecessary.
What political and economic factors were behind the critical turning points of 1989, the year the dominoes began to fall?
What brought down the wall?
Expert opinions are all over the map. Was it the arms race, hard times in the Soviet Union?
And what about Reagan's speech in 1987 and Gorbachev's new ideas of glasnost and perestroika?
To answer these questions, join us in the Stanford classroom of Professor Condoleezza Rice as she teaches your popular class, Soviet History 101.
Good morning, class. Today's topic is the fall of the infamous Berlin Wall. As you know, the wall. Yes, Susan.
Professor Rice, can you discuss whether pressure from the West was a significant factor in the fall of the wall?
Excellent question. I'll have my teaching assistant speak to that by first reviewing World War II.
To defeat Hitler, Russia and the U.S. joined forces, but the tension between democracy and communism was always present.
The Soviet armies occupied the countries they liberated from Nazi control, resulting in the wide-scale expansion of the USSR.
Despite America's desire to contain communism, we did nothing to help the countries that were absorbed. This was known as the Western Betrayal.
As to whether pressure from the West contributed to the fall, experts disagree.
Today, we will examine the internal and external factors that weakened the wall. The first real turning point that originated in the West occurred during the Berlin blockade, when the wall was not yet obvious to the naked eye, for it was composed of something invisible: terror. But one person poked a small hole through the invisible wall, and soon a breeze of hope could be felt on the other side. He was a young American pilot stationed in Berlin named Gail Halverson, who had an idea.
Turning point, 1949.
Hey, David, can you help me out here? I need to make some parachutes so I can drop goodies to the poor children in Berlin.
Wow, Gail, looks like you want to be a candy bomber.
Moved by compassion for the hungry children he saw each day outside the gates of Tempelhof Air Base, Gail's idea involved making candy parachutes to drop to them during his flights. When his fellow pilots began dropping parachutes in greater numbers, the Soviet forces threatened to shoot down their planes. Their threats prompted the U.S. Air Force to increase the number of bombers flying over Berlin and motivated thousands of people in the U.S. to collect and ship over 3 tons of candy for delivery.
Hey, Gail, where are the candy? Let's go to the commissary and buy some.
Did this one man's effort make an impact on the decisions made in Moscow? Certainly, Gail's packages were life-changing for the children who caught them. Politically, the publicity generated, combined with the massive presence of American air power, motivated a turning point in the East. After 15 months of airlifts, the Soviets lifted the blockade, allowing trains to pass again.
This was the true beginning of the Cold War, turning point in 1961. Even this tiny island of freedom posed a threat to Soviet power.
Annika, come in. Let's go over to the West while there's still a chance.
Do you think it's that bad?
Don't you see what's happening? They finished stringing up the barbed wire in the tier garden, and Iron was patrolling with guard dogs.
But this means we have to leave behind everything. And what about Oti and Bati? They never make the cross.
More and more terror and force were needed to keep the Soviet dominoes from falling. President John F. Kennedy reacted to the strengthening of the Berlin Wall with a brilliant move. He flew to Berlin in 1963 to speak directly to the people trapped behind the wall.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. Kennedy's shocking assassination prevented him from delivering his follow-up speech. He wrote, "We, in this country, and this generation are, by destiny, rather than choice, the watchmen on the wall of world freedom." JFK wanted to indirectly pressure Soviet leaders by personifying America as the watchman on the wall. He also wanted to remind them, as well as the suffering Berliners, that the West was watching over them. Unfortunately, the threat of communist expansion in Asia drew attention away from the suffering Soviet bloc in the late 60s and 70s, and all forms of Western pressure on Soviet party leaders lessened.
But even through those tumultuous decades,
Berlin still held a special place in many Americans' hearts.
one of them was named Ronald Reagan.
Turning Point 1980.
Known for coining the phrase evil empire to characterize the Soviet bloc, Reagan held a deep-seated hatred for the wall and communism.
He used the arms race to ratchet up indirect pressure on the Soviet economy. In the 5th year of his presidency, another key turning point took place. In Russia,
Turning Point 1985. Elected to the secretaryship of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, like Ronald Reagan, was a true believer in his own political system.
that system, however, was edging close to bankruptcy due to the Soviets' long-standing policy of maintaining military equality with the U.S.
Gorbachev's revolutionary decision to promote glasnost and perestroika allowed him to establish a much more open relationship with Reagan than anyone expected.
Despite the common ground reached between them during summits, Gorbachev's options were severely limited. In 1986, oversupply dramatically reduced demand for the one commodity the USSR used to keep itself afloat economically, crude oil. The sudden collapse in oil prices removed the strategic domino of economic stability the Soviet Union had come to rely upon. Turning Point.
In 1987, Reagan stood in JFK's shadow at the Brandenburg Gate.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek liberalization, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall!
Just as the drop in oil and wheat prices were draining Soviet coffers, Reagan's speech, despite the fact that few citizens of the Soviet Union heard it, heightened political pressure on Soviet party leaders at a time when hungry citizens were demanding more freedoms from Moscow.
The word crisis began to be used in party meetings, discussing the growing agitation in the Soviet bloc.
Soon, the wording became acute crisis and finally catastrophe. Gorbachev's dominoes were teetering. On December 7th, 1988, Mikhail Gorbachev gave a dramatic speech. He abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, which dictated military control over the Soviet bloc, for the so-called Sinatra Doctrine, thus allowing Soviet bloc countries to each rule themselves their way.
Gorbachev had hoped that his new ideas would revitalize the Soviet bloc, but he miscalculated badly, and the long row of dominoes started tumbling.
Turning Point 1989.
Once Hungarians dismantled their 150-mile border, East Berliners no longer had to risk the wall to escape. They could freely cross from Hungary into Austria and reach the goal many of them had cherished for decades, West Germany. There, thousands gathered in the streets. Their destination? Freedom. They massed at the wall, demanded that the guards open the gates. Their sudden appearance threw the guards into confusion. Once the guards abandoned their posts, thousands crossed over to the other side. The dominoes continued to fall. Czechoslovakia, followed by the Baltic states, other republics of the Soviet Union began demanding freedom.
It was unstoppable. During the last 2 months of 1989 and throughout 1990, the GDR ceased to exist, and East and West Berlin were gradually unified to a single city-state using one common currency.
Turning Point 1991.
On December 26th, Gorbachev announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union on national television.
Most of the Western efforts put little pressure on Moscow party leaders. Even Reagan's speech could have been ignored had the drop in oil prices not drastically depleted Gorbachev's treasury.
Gorbachev had hoped to prop up the struggling Soviet bloc.
He understood that without radical change, communism would die.
But he failed to understand that once the props of terror and force were pulled out,
The Soviet dominoes would tumble. Questions? Well then, that's enough for today. Get out there and enjoy some California sunshine. But remember, the fall of the Berlin Wall is one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century. You will see it again on your midterm.